section on counterfactual and then review how one can look at conceptualizations and theorizations driven by ideas and juxtapose them with theorizations and conceptualizations that are driven by material interests. So that is basically the last substantive lecture that I will give. And then in the next class, we will sort of review the class, share the question paper. The question paper comes to you a week in advance. And I think in the next class, I will also share my grades for the midterm exam so that you have a good understanding of how the grading is done. And then you can prepare for the final exam, which will be on the 3rd of February, right? Any questions that you have at this point? Good. So as I mentioned briefly, counterfactuals are essentially situations that could have arisen but did not arise in history. And they are like very critical moments in history. What if something had not happened? What would happen? It's very, very useful for policymakers. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis was taking place, John F. Kennedy, Robert McNamara, George Bundy, and a couple of people spent enormous amount of time trying to figure out what is it that could kill things and what will happen if they did something. I will give you some examples from this piece by Richard Nedlabo and Janice Blostein in Counterfactual Thought Experiments. Now, what happened, let's say, during the Cuban Missile Crisis is very interesting because, India and Pakistan are two nuclear weapon states, and after Pahalgam, there was a skirmish, and there would have been talk on both sides that what is it that you do now? Do you take the war further? And does it lead to a nuclear escalation, or do you stay where you are? What did Prime Minister Modi do? Would somebody else have done something else? All these kinds of questions arise. So similarly, a question arises that what would have happened if John F. Kennedy was not the president of the United States? What if Nixon had won elections and Richard Nixon had become the president of the United States? So these kinds of questions arise. You can ask the question that, would India have turned so much towards public sector dominance had the Deputy Prime Minister of India, Sardar Patel, lived longer than 1950? Because if you look at the period between 1947 and 1950, you find that India's economic policies are moving in a very different direction. So the Indian Industrial Policy Resolution of 1949 is far more welcoming towards private investment in all sectors of the Indian economy than the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. In 1949, also there were debates about the importance of the public sector, about the importance of. So in 49, only 3 sectors of the Indian economy were reserved for public sector, and those are very typical public sector sectors like atomic energy, railways. But in 1956, I think 12, 13, many more sectors came in. And that had something to do with the dominance of Nehru and how he thought about socialism and India's. So you can ask this question, what would have happened if Sardar Patel had lived longer than 1950? So all manner of questions can arise regarding what would have happened. And often when you're making decisions, especially in relation to other people, you have to predict what would the other person do. And then you have to look at alternative scenarios that, if I did this, maybe the other person would do that. So this is one of the reasons why people study non-events. The study of non-events is not so popular in political science, so you will not find a lot of books written on counterfactual analysis. So I think it's good for us to understand, what are the ways in which this particular uh, act is performed. So one of the ways in which you do it is that you have what Tetlock and Belkin in their famous book, Counterfactual Thought Experiments in World Politics, called Ideographic Case Study Counterfactual. Now, ideographic case study counterfactuals are basically much more dependent on taking a small chunk of history, which you want to replace with another chunk of history. People who do counterfactual analysis tell you that reconstructing history is not easy. So don't take a large chunk of history, take a small chunk of history and try to replace it with a deep understanding of historical facts. If you have a very deep understanding of history, then you can take an actor out of that situation and through a deep understanding of history, try to look at how the absence of that actor might actually have made a difference to the way in which history may have evolved. So who were the key players? How did they connect with each other? And what would be the impact of just taking out one of the key players out of the equation? So we can go back to sort of the Sardar Patel example, right? Sardar Patel example is very important because if you look at India becomes free in 1947. Yeah. And if you just look at the political and economy aspect of Sardar Patel, that would be very, very the Congress, in the Indian National Congress, is a very, very kind of an umbrella organization at that time. Rajni Kothari, the great political scientist, called it equal to the Indian political system rather than a political party. Why? Because it was a very peculiar social movement that got the right wing, the moderates, and the left together to debate, to cogitate. It was not like a cadre-based party which has a clear single ideology like you have in the RSS. That you have a cadre base, you have an ideology, and if you do not believe that India belongs to the Hindus and that Muslims are foreigners, then you do not belong to that ideology. Or if you can say the same for the left. They have a very clear ideology about class, about oppression, about the landed class. The Congress party was not like that. So the result of that was that the Congress party became a very broad-based social movement that brought in a lot of people. And maybe some people were excluded, like the rich landed classes were excluded to a very great extent. But there were rich farmers even in the Congress party. In that milieu, what we find is that after independence, there are huge debates on what should be the nature of Indian planning and what should be the nature of the state in Indian industry. Now, in those debates, there was a certain group of leftist radicals. I mean, in that group, you had Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, you had Jayaprakash Narayan, you would have had Subhash Chandra Bose, who unfortunately did not live to see the day in 1949. There was a planning committee within the Congress party which had a radical program for transforming the Indian economy. Now, in this milieu, there were also relatively more liberal people who believed that the private sector played an important role. So Sardar Patel was one of them. And as a result of these debates that happened between the radicals, the moderates, and the liberals, you got a fairly liberal policy in 1949. So let's say if Patel had died in 1948, I mean, I don't know that economics so well, but The question is that these people were very, very important. And at that point in time, you also find that in 1950, there is elections to the presidency of the Indian National Congress. A man called Purushottam Das Tandon, who is supported by Sardar Patel, and a man called Acharya Kripalani, who is supported by Nehru, for the presidency of the Indian National Congress. And guess who wins the elections? Tandon wins the election, not Kripalani. So the party was very democratic. I mean, Nehru's candidate would contest Patel's candidate, and finally Patel's candidate won. Tandon was also more conservative than Kripalani. So you find that until 1950, Patel was a very important person. Then Patel is also a person who is called the Iron Man of India, because as Deputy Prime Minister of India, he probably played an even more significant role than Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Because India had a very large number of princely states that had to be united into the Indian Federation. And the manner in which Sardar Patel dealt with it with a heavy hand was entirely his creation. The creation of, maybe more than 500 princely states. There was Junagadh, which could have gone to Pakistan. There was Kashmir, which could have gone to Pakistan. There were Muslim majority areas in India. And of course, there were other princely states with Hindu kings and princes. And they would not easily want to join the Indian Union because, they had their own autonomy under British rule. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to understand that, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India. He was certainly a very charismatic, very important figure, probably the most important figure after Gandhi. But it was not like there wasn't a parallel figure who was in domestic policy, probably Sardar Patel was even more important. So if you read, the biography of G.D. Birla, written by Medha Kudesia, G.D. Birla was one of the two most powerful persons in Indian industry. And if you look at that period when G.D. Birla is playing a huge role in deciding how much of the colonial reserve that has been left behind by the British should be shared with Pakistan. He's playing a huge role in figuring out what should be the relationship with the World Bank. Until 1950, G.D. Birla, one of India's top two businessmen, is actually in all the major negotiations that are taking place, which have anything to do with economic policy. And Sardar Patel himself used to live in G.D. Birla's house whenever he came to Delhi. Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated in G.D. Birla's house by Nathuram Godse. He's a very important person. But if you read that biography, you will find that as soon as Sardar Patel dies in 1915, his importance has declined. So G.D. Birla, Medha Kudesia notes, G.D. Birla going to meet Jawaharlal Nehru. And of course, Jawaharlal Nehru is very polite and very kind. But every time he wants to talk to Nehru, Nehru was very fond of a giant panda, which I think the Chinese had. And he would start looking at the giant panda outside his window. And not just he, the other tall business person at that time, J.R.D. Tata, he's actually reported that, when he would go to meet Nehru, he would start looking at the giant panda. So what does that tell you? That tells you that Nehru is basically trying to say that I won't follow the communist path like Russia and the Soviet Union, but you guys are not going to have that kind of a thing in economic policy making. So why am I giving you all this history? I'm giving you all this history for you to understand that the fact that India went for the second five-year plan of 1956 was actually the foundation stone of what is called import substituting industrialization. Import substituting industrialization in India means that India is not so interested in promoting exports. It is much more interested in developing its domestic industry to serve its purposes. And the two policies are not exactly similar. If you just want to develop your industry, you need a separate set of policies than if you really want to promote export. Because you really now need to do all manner of things domestically rather than create those services and goods that can be exported. And the two have actually very different ramifications. So I think I would have explained that last semester in the political economy of development class. And I think I will be teaching a seminar next semester on. So the question is that, you really, in that import substituting scenario, you went for a situation where you did not promote export, you did not promote consumer goods, you neglected agriculture to some extent, but you went for import substitution. Now, this is something that, and the second five-year plan of 1956 was inspired by a Soviet plan of the 1920s. Co-authored by a great statistician, physicist, P.C. Mahanovich, who became the first deputy chairman of the planning. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you really want to see how India would have gone, you can just see what would have happened if Sardar Patel had not been taken off. All right. Or you can ask a similar question for Pakistan, that what if Muhammad Ali Jinnah had lived longer? Had Muhammad Ali Jinnah lived longer, would the democratic traditions of Pakistan become stronger? And you can come to two kinds of answers. You can say that even if he had lived longer, it wouldn't have happened because many of these people were outsiders, not from inside Pakistan. So it would be very difficult for them to sustain the local base in politics. And then in the context of a very powerful military tradition, which is pre-colonial, this was going to happen. Or you can come to the conclusion with a very nuanced understanding of history, saying that, no, I mean, these people, these landed people may have not landed from India, but Jinnah was a towering figure. And he would have, if he had lived like Nehru much longer, he would have set traditions, in the parliament, in the Supreme Court. Now, why am I telling you these stories? The reason why I'm telling you these stories is for you to understand that how well you can answer this question depends on how deeply you know that history. And ideographic case study counterfactuals are very, very deeply dependent on how deeply you know that history. So if you go to this book, Tetlock and Belkin, and there's a chapter by Ned Labo and Janet Stein, they actually do a very good job of looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is a very good case, like there are others as well. You look at how counterfactual analysis was used. The Cuban Missile Crisis can be juxtaposed with Pahalgam. I mean, you can argue, like some people said, that if India really went so much into Pakistan's territory, why did it retreat? Maybe there was not any result. If there could be the alternative view that there are nuclear weapons on both sides, and that would have led to mutually assured destruction. Or there could be the view that 5 Indian planes were downed by the Pakistan Air Force, and perhaps one side of the war may have favored India, the other side of the war certainly favored Pakistan. So we don't know exactly. I mean, people outside of the armed forces may not have a precise understanding of, but the question is that from an Indian policymaker standpoint, why did you go that far and not, suddenly stop everything? And then, Mr. Trump says that I stopped the war. And when Mr. Modi fails to congratulate Mr. Trump, he slowly revs up the ante against Modi and then, puts very high tariffs on India. Then there's a huge debate inside India saying that India could have been a little more courteous to Mr. Modi and avoided such tariffs. Sanjay Babu, the journalist, came up with this idea that, we just needed leading Mr. Trump a little bit and it would have been sorted out. But it seems that Mr. Modi had a huge ego on his chip, on his shoulder, and he would not do that. But what I'm saying is that depending on where you are, you can do counterfactual analysis, right? You can actually argue what would have happened if something had not happened. I mean, of course, there was no nuclear war, right, in this particular case. And one of the things that Donald Trump said was that the two countries were very close to a nuclear war. And I stopped it from happening. That is Mr. Trump's statement. So the question is that if you know who the policymakers were, and if you know, so the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes a very important case because in, I think, September or October 1962, Soviet Union put some missiles in Cuba. And this becomes a very difficult situation because you see, the way in which the Cold War happens is that by and large, it was a stable situation, right? So you did not get even a Ukraine kind of war during the Cold War, which would involve, let's say, Soviet Union in such a big way. It remained cold partly because of the presence of nuclear weapons. And the presence of nuclear weapons with second strike capability creates a situation where you get what is called mutually assured destruction. And what is second strike capability? Second strike capability is a situation where you can digest an attack and hit back, which means that it is impossible for any one nuclear power to completely obliterate all the nuclear assets of another power. And matters are programmed in such a way that there will be a hit back. This hit back may very well happen from sea-launched ballistic missiles, which are hiding in some ocean, in some submarines. They say that, you can take off stationary targets. You may even hit targets that are moving on trains. Oftentimes, these assets are moved by aircraft, but the safest way of maintaining the second strike and deterrence is nuclear-based sea-launched ballistic missiles, which, because, submarines are such small things compared to the vastness of the ocean that it's almost impossible to obliterate the nuclear assets that are hiding in submarines. So clearly you have Soviet Union and you have, and so so the question is that these people ask this question that one is the resolve question, that had Kennedy displayed greater resolve prior to the crisis, Khrushchev would not have sent missiles to Cuba. So there is actually a very interesting conversation that happens, which I have not heard, but I have heard people have heard, who do sort of alternative scenarios. And that is actually public record now. People can access those. So these people, so apparently Schlesinger and Sorensen said that prior resolve was important to deter. So what is happening in the Cold War is that either the United States or the Soviet Union are slowly, gradually, without getting into war fighting mode, increasing their spheres of influence. So when you have a Cuba in Latin America, it is your sphere of influence. The entire continent doesn't belong to the Americans. Then if you put nuclear weapons in Cuba, then you move the step further. This happened in 1962. In 1970s, I think 78 or 79, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Now that became a big problem for American foreign policy. Why? Because Afghanistan was kind of a buffer between sort of Soviet interests and American interests. Now, Pakistan was an ally of the United States, and Soviet Union extended up to Afghanistan. But when you invade Afghanistan, then obviously the Americans have to think very differently about the Cold War. So the Cold War happened in such incremental ways of trying to increase your sphere of influence. So if you go back to that period, you'll find that Jimmy Carter is not willing to give very much to General Zia before the invasion of Afghanistan. He's a liberal-minded, human rights-oriented guy. But as soon as the invasion happened, General Zia can bargain. He gets the latest F-16. He gets a lot of military aid and other aid. And then Pakistan really creates the Mujahideen that fight the Soviet occupation, which comes to then later on create problems for Pakistan. So I'm giving you the Afghanistan example for you to understand how the Cold War proceeded. Similarly, when firstly, you have Fidel Castro, you have your friend in the continent. Now, this is not something that the Americans like, but if nuclear weapons land there, that means the Soviets have taken one step further, and that does not please the Americans. So Schlesinger and Sorensen are arguing that had Kennedy shown greater resolve prior to the crisis, this would not have happened. Had Khrushchev doubted US resolve after the crisis, he would have challenged the Western position in Berlin and elsewhere. So, there can be resolve on both sides. So Khrushchev thinks that there is resolve. So he doesn't do things. Berlin is right here, and don't forget, Berlin was divided into two parts. I mean, Dresden was on the other side, Leipzig was on the other side, and Berlin was divided. So this was really the cutting edge frontier of the Cold War. And if you really wanted to do something drastic, you could do it there. Then there is the early warning hypothesis that had President Kennedy issued a timely warning in the spring of 1962, Khrushchev might not have sent missiles to Cuba. George Allison, George and Smoke, all of these people held this view. Had President Kennedy practiced deterrence more forcibly in September, Khrushchev might have aborted the missile deployment. Deterrence means that you do something so that the other person is stopped from doing something which is aggressive. That is deterrence. So nuclear weapons can be a deterrent. Nuclear weapons could have deterred a big war between India and Pakistan. So there was a war in 1949, there was a war in 1905, there was a war in 1971, but there's been no major war after that. And some people have argued that it is because of the deterrence that nuclear weapons have created, that there are nuclear weapons on both sides, and therefore a big, large-scale war is not likely. Then there is a public deployment. Had Khrushchev publicly announced his intention to send missiles to Cuba to deter an American attack before Kennedy's warning in September, the president would have found it extremely difficult to threaten force to remove the missile. This is like George Bundy and so on. So basically, I mean, if you go through the chapter, you will see these alternative scenarios playing themselves out in a way that you will try to see. I mean, one of the ways of looking at it would be that, let's say, if Kennedy had been more aggressive, would there have been a nuclear war? Or if Kennedy had been more aggressive, would the Soviets send missiles to Cuba? Those kinds of questions are asked. And I'm just giving you certain examples of how people who plan are often looking at counterfactual situations. Because they're looking at alternative scenarios. They're looking at alternative scenarios also because they don't know what Khrushchev will do. This is a world with nuclear weapons. This is not a world where you can fight another world war. I mean, God forbid, if tomorrow Donald Trump takes on Greenland. Why do I say God forbid? Because yesterday I heard the British Prime Minister saying that we are the closest ally of the United States of America. We are constantly in touch with the White House. But there are certain things that we will not accept. Now, if you just go back, you will find that The Danish foreign minister and the Greenland minister met Marco Rubio recently. And they tried to give all the international legal arguments about why Greenland should not be taken over by the United States. You can have your bases, you can take your minerals. They must have also given arguments about the settlements, that there are people, there are the Inuit people who belong to the place, then there are the Scandinavian people who live there. It's very difficult to have a life there. And then they might have even said that, look, most of these people want to live in the welfare state of Denmark rather than in the United States of America. Right? So they might have, I don't know what that lady and that gentleman told Marco Rubio, but it's clear that there was a long conversation. And that long conversation did not lead to Donald Trump saying that, now the American flag is on Greenland. It led to a situation where Donald Trump said that we will put 10% tariffs on Europe until such time that we resolve the dispute. Right? Now, apparently Donald Trump also wrote a letter to the Norwegian president or prime minister saying that, why did you not give me the Nobel Prize? If you didn't have the Nobel Prize, this is not right. And the Norwegian president or prime minister would have said that, look, I don't give the prize. The prize is selected by a committee. No, I'm saying all this because now, let's say Europe has to decide how to act, or let's say the United States has to decide how to act. Then the Europeans will be looking at alternative scenarios. What will the Americans do? Should we show resolve or should we not show resolve? One argument is that if you do not show resolve, the Americans will not respect you. The other argument could be that if Europe shows resolve, then you will kill a relationship and possibilities of cooperation with the world's largest economy and the world's largest. So it can work both ways. But until such times that Greenland has been pursued so aggressively, these questions are not arising. But now, I guess Friedrich Merz, Starmer, and the leaders they all must be coming together to understand what will Donald Trump do if we put some things on the table. And they're looking at counterfactual conditions. They have no way of knowing what Donald Trump will do. So if we did this, then this could happen. If we did that, then that could happen. A lot of people on the ground are saying that Russia and China are really not the kind of threats they're making it out to be. So this is just like you've taken over Venezuela's leaders. Now you want to take on a large part of territory. They're even saying that we will buy this territory. And I think Denmark is saying that, no, we will not sell it. So all these kinds of questions arise in international relations, especially under crisis scenarios. How much can India penetrate into Pakistan without provoking a nuclear retaliation? So the Pakistan army chiefs and others are all constantly saying that, look, we have nuclear weapons. Those weapons are there to be used. Now, this is a calculation that the Indian policymakers have to make. Right? How much pain will Pakistan take? Now, the question is that European security, senior British statespersons are saying that America does not put all the money into European security. This is just a fallacy. America puts more money than any other country into securities and into its weapons. But those are not all meant for Europe. They could be meant for other parts of the world. And at least on NATO, it's not like America is putting in all the money. So I'm just telling you that this ideographic stuff is very important because it takes you into real life situations where you have to understand how to deal with problems, and your deep knowledge of history is important. I'll end with another example, which I have shared with some students. which was that Shahid Javed Bhutti, former finance minister of Pakistan, who was a colleague of mine at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. And he kind of, one day he asked me that, my Beacon House University has produced a report on Pakistan's financial crisis. Why don't you go and discuss it? So I said, Shahid, why should I go and discuss the report that you've written? Because I'm not an expert on the Pakistan economy. He said, no, you're not an expert on the Pakistan economy, but I've read your book. And having been a former president of the World Bank, vice president of the World Bank, I know how these multilaterals work. So if you can put some intelligence into the head of the Pakistan sort of diplomat, and that would be of some use to Pakistan, because India dealt with the crisis very well. You know how the Indians dealt with the crisis, and Pakistan is not doing all of those things. So where is this idea coming from? This idea is coming from the fact that you have a deep knowledge of crisis management. And Pakistan is not using the kind of knowledge that should be used to manage its economic crisis. So policymakers should actually move in a different direction. They should probably not listen to the IMF and the World Bank. He can't say that because he was vice president of the World Bank himself. They have to be far more critical about the kind of conditionalities that arise. But at the same time, they should have a cooperative relationship. So when you're looking at counterfactual scenarios, you could say that what if Pakistan had dealt with a major financial crisis in a different way? Would that have transformed the Pakistan economy like it did the Indian economy? So that could be a question. Then nomothetic counterfactuals are actually far more dependent on an understanding of, let's say, theories that explain history. So now you want to know something happens, and you want to know what is it that would have happened if something did not happen. So here, what you subtract from the situation is not the actor, but rather that variable. Or add, not the actor, but the variable. So the question can arise that what would have happened if the bourgeoisie were far more entrenched in France? Would the French Revolution have happened? What would have happened if the bourgeoisie were far more entrenched in Russia? Would the Russian Revolution have happened? So we know that the bourgeoisie produces democracy. And there are theories that connect with social structure, which have to do with the peasantry and the fight between the peasantry and the landed, largely in the absence of a bourgeoisie and a capitalist mode of production, that often when the balance of power changes, the feudal aristocracy can be taken on by revolutionary means. Revolutionary means that you completely change the order. So there is China before the revolution and there's China after the revolution. It's completely changed. There's no private property. It's not like India. The British have gone. There is a constitution. You have moved in the direction of socialism, but you have lots of elements of the Government of India Act of 1935. Of course, some people have lost, some people have gained. There have been changes which are remarkable, but not like in China, that you have a certain kind of Maoist communist ideology, which is completely in contradistinction with what prevailed in China before Mao. And there's been a bloody revolutionary takeover. And the vestiges of that revolution probably still arrive, although in China has become far more export-oriented, somewhat more private sector-oriented. But many of the Communist Party still, reigns dominant, right? And perhaps, Chinese capital today doesn't sit on top of the party as much as, let's say, American capital sits on top of American politics. Right? So those are nomothetic kinds of arguments. That what would have happened if the bourgeoisie was if you look at the revolution in Britain, about which I will talk, you find that we call it the Glorious Revolution, but it's not such a revolution. Because what has happened is that the balance of power between the monarch and the capitalist wealth holders has changed. So the feudal class has become somewhat less powerful. But they have not gone away in 1688. We call it a glorious revolution because it certainly brings capital into governance in a much bigger way. It brings business people and capital into governance in a much bigger way than it was in feudal England. But it's not like a radical revolution like the one you see in China or in Russia or even in France. So those are nomothetic counterfactuals. And then you can actually combine nomothetic and idiographics because they are not completely separate. They are the two ideas can be combined. And one example in this book is the metaphor from the disappearance of the dinosaurs. So they say that according to one estimate, if a 6 to 12 mile wide asteroid hits the Earth at 44,000 miles per hour, we can theoretically predict a host of events such as the size of the crater, the atmosphere, climate, trace elements in a particular geological strata, antipodal volcanism, etc., which might have produced something as drastic as the extinction of the dinosaurs. Because the extinction of the dinosaurs is a puzzle. How could such a powerful species, whose skeletons we find all over the world, suddenly disappear when they were so overwhelmingly powerful? And you can also think of conceivable causes related to other sort of ideas, like there was some kind of a huge volcanic eruption or something like that. So the authors say that when you are looking at, let's say, the meteor hit, there is a lot of science that can tell you that what should be the size of the meteor, what should be the velocity at which it hits, and if it does, what kinds of changes it can bring about on the Earth and in the atmosphere. So you can combine your understanding of the physical world with your understanding of, let's say, evolution as it was taking place at that point in time, and bringing together sort of nomothetic and idiographic understandings to be convinced more or less that it was a meteor that came. We can't conclusively prove it, right? So you can bring the two together. Then there are also computer simulations that you can do. Some people are nowadays doing computer simulations to show you create alternative worlds, and then there are scholars who created alternative worlds, run computer simulations. You program alternative worlds, and then you let the alternative worlds evolve. And according to one serious study, it is suggested that balance of power is not always negative. Now, this is a very interesting, somewhat dangerous finding, right? So one of the major theories in international relations is balance of power, which means that if anybody aspires towards global hegemony, then ultimately power will be balanced. So Hitler tried that and he was balanced. And who balanced Hitler? Even Stalin and Churchill came together. So it has got nothing to do with friendship or ideas. It is just that, the two hated each other, but they came together. What is balance of power? Today, when Donald Trump has risen, the relations between China and India have improved. Now, until such times, India was feeling the threat from China because of certain skirmishes that have taken place on the border, because of misunderstandings regarding what is China and where is India. But when Donald Trump has put 50% tariffs on India. Similarly, the Canadian Prime Minister has also gone to China. Why? Because tomorrow there's Greenland, and then so so you don't know. Up to a certain point in time, the Americans might have been thinking that China and Russia are the threat. Now they want to plant something on Greenland. So all of Europe will also feel very threatened, right? So, I mean, at least the news that I was hearing yesterday suggested that from the British Prime Minister to the German Chancellor, they are all not very much at ease with the way in which Donald Trump is behaving. And especially after that letter he wrote saying that I should have the Nobel Prize. So this is balance of power, right? So one way of thinking of international relations is that there's an anarchical system, there is no supranational authority. But if people feel insecure, I mean, so tomorrow, if the United States plants a flag, says that Greenland is my territory, NATO as an organization whose Article 5 ensures collective security will end. Because one NATO member, so collective security means what? Collective security means that America's security is Germany's security, is Britain's security, and they will all collectively fight. The Danes have done that. They've lost some 50, 60 lives in Afghanistan. That was somewhat similar to the principle that the Soviets and the Indians had in the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1971, where it was clearly stated that India's security is coterminous with Soviet Union security. NATO is something like that. Now, if one NATO member, who is supposed to be the most influential member, says that I feel insecure if this territory belongs to you, then collective security will fail. And when that collective security fails, there will emerge a very different kind of a balance of power, right? And that could be one of the reasons why Chancellor Merz has visited India. And at least the way in which the English media is capturing it, both in Germany, seems like a bit of a historic visit. So maybe the same free trade agreement where Europe would have given India much more stringent conditions will be signed. Because, if the Americans have put tariffs on the Indians and the Europeans, they need markets and they will be willing. Maybe India also be willing to negotiate better because now there is 50% tariff. After that, they are saying that if you have anything to do with Iran, then it can go up to 500%. That means the American market is blocked. And America is the most influential trading partner because America is the country with whom India has a trade surplus. With China, it has a huge trade imbalance. When the American market was considered to be more liberal, more open. And if that market closes down, and India has an export-led growth strategy. So where do you go? Then you have to go to other parts of the world. So Europe has a free trade agreement with Mercosur. The free trade agreement with Mercosur has happened when European farmers have very unwillingly accepted the idea that beef and other products will come from Latin America. Similarly, tomorrow, 26th January is India's Republic Day. I think they are aiming to have some kind of a free trade agreement in principle agreed by the 26th of January. Right? The agreement may not be signed, but in principle, that is what German and Indian diplomats are trying to do. Now, this may not have happened if Donald Trump had not said that, I'm going to take up Greenland, I'm going to put so many tariffs on you. So why am I saying this? This is because balance of power is considered to be, but according to some computer simulations, when they try to recreate history in an anarchical system, they found that balance of power always does not emerge. Now, this can be a bit of a tragedy for anybody who is not the most powerful state, right? If a balance of power does not emerge, then that means that you are just lucky. When Hitler was trying to be a global hegemon and a balance of power did emerge to contain Hitler. So computer simulations do those kind of things. And people who do mental simulation counterfactuals work much more at a psychological level of beliefs. What if a policymaker was a structural realist? What if a policymaker was a dove rather than a hawk? They try to put those kind of things to look at counterfactuals. Do you have any questions at this point in time? Sounds clear. Okay. So then, Tetlock and Belkin say that there are 6 things that you should consider. One is, does one independent variable impact other variables as well in the system, so that isolating that variable without making changes to the system as a whole becomes problematic? In other words, you cannot just isolate one variable that you want to delete, keeping all others constant. If multipolarity makes the world less stable, as in Kenneth Waltz, is a problem, because Waltz is just looking at a bipolar world, and multipolarity may make differences to the system that we have not imagined in this model. Now, I think the next semester I'll be in international relations. Kenneth Waltz has this very powerful book called The Theory of International Relations, where the major argument is that bipolarity is more stable than multipolarity. The book was being written in the late 1970s. This was at the height of the Cold War, and he was talking about bipolar stability. And the argument that he gives is that when you have two great powers, there are fewer collective action problems. Like you have only two superpowers, so you have one dominant Soviet Union and you have one dominant US. So you really don't have to create a lot of internal balancing, because you have two great dominant powers, and the difference between that power and its allies are huge. So it's easy to the real politics is taking place between two superpowers. So two superpowers makes it more easy to bring rationality to decisions, and it is also a situation where each superpower can assess the other more clearly. So let's say if there are 5 superpowers, then you need to know, like today, let's say China is there, then Europe is there, then the United States is there, and maybe you have to consider Russia. If your balance of power becomes multipolarity, then you have to spend a much greater amount of resources trying to figure out who is becoming stronger, how, and what kinds of impacts must it have. So from that perspective, Waltz had argued that bipolarity is more stable than multipolarity. Now the question is that there may be things that multipolarity does which are not in Waltz's model, because he's basically looked at foreign relations during the bipolar period. And a critique of that is the fact that the concept of Vienna, which was born, I think, around 1814, 1815, lasted till about 1917. So for 100 years, there was no major war in Europe. And this is considered to be an anomaly. Why? Because the concept of Vienna was, according to Robert Jervis, in a famous article, he writes that the concept of Vienna was a multipolar system, almost which became like an institution. So the fact that one power had to contribute something to balance power in Europe became like a principle that was driving European politics during these 100 years. And the result of that is that multipolarity was already very stable. So the point being made here is that perhaps Waltz was not looking at aspects of multipolarity, which would have gone against his arguments, because the balance of power system actually worked in a multipolar world. Then there is co-tenability and logical. So John Mueller argues that a non-nuclear world would be equally stable, drawing lessons from the same thing. he traces the same history, but would the Cuban Missile Crisis have occurred without nuclear weapons? Would the Soviets have taken all those risks with conventionally armed intermediate range ballistic missiles? It's an important point that Mueller makes. How well do we understand the causal mechanism that connects events? We may know better what would have happened if we did not get stuck in a tough jam than what would have happened if we did not have nuclear weapons. Now, John Mueller's piece about nuclear weapons goes against the grain, because many people, ranging from Kenneth Waltz to Robert Jervis, have argued that nuclear weapons makes the world more stable because of deterrence, because of nuclear structure. But John Mueller actually writes a very sophisticated story arguing that this is overstated, that even if there were no nuclear weapons, the same things that we see in the world would have actually happened. But he does kind of a counterfactual analysis, because he is not looking at the world without nuclear weapons. The world already has nuclear weapons. So he has to recreate that history of the world without nuclear weapons in order to argue that even without nuclear weapons, he would not be able to. So that is co-tenability and logical consistency. What is the theory of deterrence and nuclear weapons? How can I take on that theory of deterrence and nuclear weapons by recreating a world without nuclear weapons? So that, in order to get published, in order to get appreciated, Mueller would have to argue that I have recreated that world rather well, taking all the theoretical propositions there. Then there is consistency with well-established historical fact. This, of course, I don't need to restate, because this comes from videographic idea. So on the one hand, you have the theoretical side, which is that what is the theory of nuclear weapons? Why does it produce peace? And then what is it that we know about the history of nuclear weapons? So consistency with well-established theoretical laws and projectability. Theoretical laws, no bourgeoisie, no democracy, or nuclear weapons produce deterrence. Projectability, can we project our findings to different types of cases? Can conflicts in international relations under anarchic conditions be used to understand conflicts in tribal societies? Like, you can argue that tribal societies often work with norms in the absence of a supranational or like a stable sovereign type of authority. So is what we are seeing in tribal societies projectable to international relations? So you take basically your own understandings to a very different realm, but where similar structural conditions prevail. So there are people who have actually written on anarchy by studying tribal society. There are people, because they're saying that if you want to understand what will happen in anarchy, anarchy in international relations is a realm where you don't have a sovereign. And there are pieces where people have argued that one way to understand this realm would be to go to a tribal society, which has very similar structural characteristics. And those people have argued that despite the absence of a sovereign in a tribal setting, norms do evolve. There is a way in which people learn how to behave and avoid conflicts. So that is projectability. So we've ended one section of the lecture, which concerned counterfactuals. Do you have any questions? And now I will briefly spend some time looking at the debates between materialism and ideational approaches. Any questions? So when you read, the stuff can sound a little difficult, but it's actually not so difficult. It is very simple. A lot of the times, the books make it read a little more tricky than it really is. But I think these are sort of the ideas about counterfactuals. You don't need to worry so much about computer simulations and mental frameworks. I mean, you can stick more to idiographic and nomothetic, and combination of these two. Good, so we can go into the next section. So here what is happening is that I want you to appreciate that when you're reading stuff, you will actually find that there are people maybe inspired by Marx who are looking at conflict, producing change, which are driven by what we can call material factors. That there are certain things that are happening in society where different groups have different interests, and these different groups which have different interests come into conflict. And the way we understand how these conflicts are resolved is the way in which you will understand how an institution is born. So, I mean, I think I talked in other classes also about Lenin's imperialism. There, the whole idea is that imperialism emerged as a result of the birth of capitalism, which had evolved to a certain high level, which is called monopoly level. So monopoly capital in advanced capitalism has two characteristics. One is very large scale of production. So you can't just sell your own goods. And this is a problem that Germany has today. Germany was, until at least 1 or 2 years ago, the largest automaker in the world. Now, if Germany can't sell its cars, how can the German economy be prosperous? Or let's say if BYD starts producing electric cars, Tesla gets threatened, right? Because up to a point in time, Tesla thought that it is like a real market leader. Let's say if people move from the internal combustion engine to electric cars, then it will create a problem for Germany, unless Germany can adjust. Or if tomorrow, Trump produces tariffs and Germany can't sell cars, so then BYD, BMW, Mercedes, and all will start opening more factories in the United States, as they have already in China. So the point is that Lenin was saying that the capitalist class has reached that level of production where you can't just prosper by selling inside your market. And it is aided by finance which comes from the banking system, which helps it grow even more. So there's a marriage of finance capital and this has led to a situation where advanced capitalist countries can't do anything else but go for imperialism. Now, what does that say? That says that, okay, you're not looking at conflict, but it's basically the power of the capitalist class which is ruling the state. Right? This is one argument. Then there's a man called Hobson who critiqued Lenin by saying that, well, it is not really the capitalist class, because he argued that the long run interests of the capitalist class will not be serviced by imperialism. It's the arms industry in Britain that gains from imperialism. Now, in both of these arguments, you see that there is a certain economic class which is driving policy. So there is a class or a group which has defined interests, and those interests are driving policy. You don't need any ideas. I mean, if you're going to argue that trade unions did a strike and that strike produced higher wages, you don't need ideas, because we know that trade unions support workers and workers gain from wages, right? So this is considered to be such a, let's say, intrinsic part of rationality that people will not associate ideas with it. If workers start saying that, look, we want fewer wages and we want to live like poor people, that would mean that there is an ideation. So a group of workers come together to get wages. That means what? That means the capitalist class has made some compromise, because the capitalist class will benefit. Its profits will be higher if the wages of the workers become lower, right? So you can understand the conflicts between the capitalist class and the. Now, these are typically arguments that show that you have material factors which are represented in the interests of different groups in society that come into power. And from that perspective, I think the piece by North and Weingart in the Journal of Economic History is like Lenin's piece, a classic argument. So in that piece, which I teach in almost every class, we find that the parliament in England was not like any kind of a welfare society, like we said, representatives of the people. Firstly, there was no universal adult franchising. When people who got to vote in Britain expanded over time, they did not include workers for a long time, they did not include women for a long time. The parliament was some kind of a representation, but North and Weingart say that initially, in the 17th century, the parliament was just a bunch of capitalists. And capitalists as a class had emerged separately from the aristocracy. So under feudal conditions, there was no powerful capitalist class. So it was the kings and the dukes and the landed which had power. Land brought power. Even today, if you ask the British monarchy, they look down on capitalists. They're very rich. But they don't like these people who do bazaar kind of work. So the beauty of this piece is that he says that the parliament in Britain emerged like a trade union of the capitalist class. And the capitalist class, because it was becoming rich and powerful, began to have problems with the aristocracy. And what was the nature of the problem? The nature of the problem was largely that the aristocracy and the king or the queen would constantly ask money from the rich and the wealthy in order to fight their wars. There could be wars of colonialism, there could be wars in Europe. There are lots of wars happening. And the monarch or the king would constantly go and say, we want more, we want more, we want more. These people would go back and say that, look, please give us back at least the principal, if not the interest. And the king would say that, look, we are fighting for God and country. What is this kind of cheap, bazari attitude you have? So the people who were becoming wealthy through capitalism were unhappy with the way in which the aristocracy, led by the monarch, was behaving with them, extracting the riches that they had. So North and Weingart say that this is really the reason why the Glorious Revolution of 1688 took place, because there was a very powerful class of people who could take on the aristocracy. And in taking on the aristocracy, the absolute powers of the crown that made it was the absolute powers of the crown that made the parliament and the wealth holders legislative. So the crown had three sources of power. One was the crown had the power to proclaim royal ordinances. These were quasi-legislative powers without parliamentary consent. These were enforced through common law courts. There was the Star Chamber with legislative, executive, and judicial powers that could reverse the judgments against the crown. And the crown managed the day-to-day functions of government and could easily influence judges. So what happened? After the Glorious Revolution, opposition was building up. The Star Chamber was abolished by an act that required all property-related cases to be tried in the common law court. Restrictions against monopolies were enforced. A legislation was passed to call the parliament regularly to work and not at the behest of the crown. The royal administrative apparatus was dismantled. Labor mobility was increased. Land tenure legislations made land free for various types of use. The Civil War led to the end of monarchy and the House of Lords. Its failure led to the return of the crown in 1666. The 104-member parliament returned in the mid-1680s. The crown was extended to William and Mary in 1688 after dethroning Charles I and James II. The Glorious Revolution caused the fiscal revolution and an institutional transformation. So this tells you that there was compromise. When the when these when these kind of things happened, there was an extreme position. So parliamentary supremacy was established in government. It had the exclusive authority to raise new taxes. The Crown's revenue generating authority was limited. The Parliament had a veto power over expenditures and it could place constraints on the Crown. Royal prerogative powers were reduced and judges were made independent of the royal. Parliamentary supremacy, however, did not mean monopoly. This put the government on a sound financial footing. Private benefits at public expense required cooperation between the Crown, the Parliament, and the court. The Parliament had to clear the financial proposal of the Crown. The conservative big government did not interfere with the court. There was a fiscal revolution. The first loan of £1 million granted to the Crown via taxes was raised in 1619, was exhausted by 1694. For the next large loan, subscribers were incorporated as the Bank of England. This is very important. The Bank of England is born as a result of this conflict as a regulator of credit, which means that whatever the Crown wants for wars of imperialism or for lavish expenditures have to be cleared by the Bank of England, regulated by the Parliament. Which means that there will be a principal that has to be returned and there has to be an interest that is returned. So if you are fighting the war of colonialism successfully, then you can pay back. There's some discipline. You can't say that, look, I have earned so much, but I didn't. There's oversight. The bank could not lend without explicit consent of the Parliament. This ensured that the Crown paid back this interest. This led to increased borrowing and helped finance war. As the risk associated with debt fell, so did the interest rates. What that means is that the Crown got a lot of money. So then there are two things. One is that this is a story of endogenous economic change, which means that there's no meteor that hit Britain from outside. Capitalism was growing. It was a materialistic development taking place within Britain as a result, maybe of because you believe in Marx, technological changes and other things. And this kind of change, which led to the consolidation of capitalism, which may also have promoted imperialism, happened as a result of the conflict between two kinds of groups. One is the group of the capitalist rich who were pitted against the aristocratic rich. And the result was some kind of an understanding that the capitalist rich cannot just be held unaccountable. And that is how the Parliament was born. North and Weinglass would say that perhaps this is the reason why British colonialism was so successful. Because there was a disciplined way of borrowing money, and with that money, you could make more money. If France did not have that opportunity, it may have had less credit to fight the wars of imperialism. So you get some understanding of a materialist conception. There is Pranab Bhattan's work on the dominant and proprietary classes of India. I would also classify that as a materialistic conception of it, where he argues that the farmers, sorry, I shouldn't have said landed, the farmers, the professionals, and the industrialists are the three powerful classes in India which are driving policies. And the result of this kind of a drive produces conflict, because a lot of the things that the farmers want are not good for industry. Both farmers and industrialists want more and more subsidies. And the professionals who, and he was writing this in the 1980s, were very powerful, government bureaucrats. They still are powerful, but they were even more powerful under a government where the state was controlling the economy to a greater extent. They had their privileges. So this is the story of how these three dominant and proprietary classes fought with each other, where the state only had the relative autonomy to balance on the margin the power of these groups, which produced a policy that led to excessive spending. And in the end, probably the balance of payments crisis, which India had to deal with in the late 90s. Then there is Mark Blyth's story about the great transformation, where Blyth does something very different. Now I'm coming from materialistic to more ideational approaches. Mark Blyth, Theda Skocpol, all of these people argue that the state was very important in the United States of America for pursuing Keynesian policies. Keynesian policies did not come because of any great labor movement. Keynesian policies came because at the time of the Great Depression, no economic policy ideas were working under the classical framework. And Keynes had already written his classic on money and employment around that time. So American policymakers somehow looked at the similarity between the Great Depression and the kinds of problems that John Maynard Keynes had talked about in his book. Because until then, most people used to think that markets will automatically adjust and there will be equilibrium. Keynes had talked about market failures and market interventions and the need to actually make fiscal expenditures that can go beyond balancing budgets in order for the economy to go back to an equilibrium. So Mark Blyth, in his book, argues that there is a situation called Knightian uncertainty. Knightian uncertainty is a situation where policymakers really do not know probabilistically what is the best policy. And there they have to be driven by the persuasive power of an idea, given the conditions on the ground. And those logics of appropriateness that arise out of these ideas can then produce paradigm shifts in policy. So this is not like the dominant and proprietary classes in India or the conflict between the capitalists and the aristocracy. This has got something to do with how policymakers actually thought that a certain set of ideas will work. And then you know that John Maynard Keynes was born and he lived in Britain, but his ideas were implemented in the US. And it's only after the end of the Second World War that his ideas traveled to Europe, also largely to American. And then in my book, and we will ask you to read the piece in the Review of National Political Economy, I argue that even India has, I compared two balance payment crises, 1966 and 1991. And I argue that in 1966, India became even more closed. 1966, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister. A lot of people think that Nehru was illiberal. He closed the Indian economy. But in 1966, when India had a balance of payments crisis, when the World Bank and the IMF wanted India to open up, India actually went for an even more stringent version of the closed economy model than anything that Nehru had tried. And I mean, of course, in the paper, it is described briefly, but there is a longer chapter in my book on the 66 crisis, on the 1991 crisis, looking at a lot of archival material, which suggests that that had a lot to do with how Indian policymakers thought about the crisis. It didn't have so much to do with the fact that labor unions were unhappy or that industrialists wanted. India devalued the currency for a very brief period, made some very minimal changes to policy, but within 6 months, they moved in a completely different direction, such that Mrs. Gandhi's turning to the left was a far more radical move than Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1991, on the other hand, I argue that there was a similar crisis. But the reason why India embraced globalization and deregulation had to do with how India had begun criticizing its own policy from the mid-1970s. And how the weight of ideas favoring deregulation had actually become far more significant within the state. And that is the reason why India was able to go for what we call a heterodox reform package. What is a heterodox reform package? A heterodox reform package at the time of a balance of payments crisis, when the IMF and the World Bank become very important, is not an orthodox package. So you don't do exactly what the multilaterals want you to do. But by and large, you signal that the direction you want to take is the same, but you will do it in a different way. So trade unions were not abolished, small scale industry was not abolished. Even the fiscal deficit, which was reduced only for a year, was allowed to grow. And India's fiscal responsibility management bill, which came much later, happened at a time after the crisis was over. So it had a lot to do with India not wanting to become again beholden to the IMF and the World Bank, rather than an IMF prescription. And one of the authors of the Fiscal Responsibility and Management Act was actually the finance minister of a communist-led government in West Bengal, Oshimdar. So the point being made here is that India's deregulation that happened was not because the business class wanted it. In fact, the business class was scared because they were very comfortable within the closed economy, and they were worried that with more competition, can they survive? They, of course, became very rich. Subsequently, they realized, but it was driven by the state. So if you want a nutshell argument, it is in the Review of International Political Economy. If you want to get into greater detail, there are chapters in the book, Globalization and Deregulation. But this was like adopting a policy that India had become quite convinced of. So India went for a major devaluation in July 3 or 4 of 1994. But it was not something that India did suddenly. In the 1980s, India had slowly, very gradually devalued the rupee so that the opponents of the policy will not even recognize it. It was done in a very gradual way. And the policymakers who were among the smartest at that time knew what devaluation would do to India's exports. So it was not like a night and uncertainty. They had already experimented. Then in minimal ways, the information technology sector had also been opened up. There was an IT policy of 1980, there was an IT policy of 1984, there was an IT policy of 1986. Then a major regulatory stringent regulation under the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act had also been diluted. So policymakers had a good understanding of what would happen with domestic deregulation. So they went for radical domestic deregulation. So the entire policy of licensing was abolished in 1990. So on the 2nd and 3rd of July, there was a massive devaluation. And on the 24th of July, there was an industrial policy resolution, which was as historic as the industrial policy resolution of 1950. It means that India has changed tracks. And then there was a budget of 19 July. So the budget and the industrial policy resolution both came about on the 24th of July, which is the period after which you have actually begun to see rapid economic growth. But rapid economic growth came with growing inequality. And that became clear to the government. So that around 2005 onwards, you have a radical rights-based approach, where it became very clear to the government that just economic growth is not going to produce poverty alleviation. And then you had, again, a more profound sort of redistribution strategy than anything that they had tried in the early years after the event. So you can look at, did the redistribution strategy happen because of social movements, or did it happen because of, if it happened because of social movements, then it's closer to a materialistic perception, that people have interests, their incomes were falling, they rose. But if it is that the National Advisory Council under Mrs. Sonia Gandhi and a large number of activists were able to take on neoliberalism to some extent and replace it with a social democratic approach, then that would be an ideational way of thinking. So I think with that, I come to the end of my lectures. The next class will be devoted to